On this day, in 1812, October 13th, the first battle of the War of 1812 began. Before we talk about the war, we must talk about what preceded it. The American author Washington Irving wrote a story in 1819 called Rip Van Winkle. Rip Van Winkle had gone into the mountains, had drank some very good alcohol, according to the story, and had fallen asleep. He woke up and he found that his musket was rusting, that his dog was gone, and that his beard had grown by a number of feet. He went back into town and he saw that the inn that used to have the image of King George III now had the image of George Washington, whom he did not know. The villagers asked him who he had voted for. He had no idea what they were talking about, and he said, "I am a loyal subject of King George III." The abuse hurled towards him after this confused him, and then he realized that things had changed. The 20 years since he had been asleep, his world had changed, the world had changed. And America was no longer British. So, the American Revolution that ended with American independence did not create just one country. It ended up creating two. The other was Canada. Canada, unlike the United States, chose to be loyal. It chose to be the opposite of the United States, which is why they have a parliament and not a congress. They have a queen and not a president. They still use British spellings in English, and they still have the Union flag or a part of that, the Cross of St. George, Cross of St. Andrews, or the Three Lions, or the One Lion, in all of the provincial flags except for Quebec. When the American Revolution had ended, 60,000 Americans had left and settled in what is now Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Nova Scotia. These were the people who had rejected American republicanism and American independence. Many of them probably left because they feared for their lives, and they gave up a lot by leaving. When they did leave, they were allowed new grants of land in these new territories. Also, many American Indians went with them. And in the subsequent wars, many of these American Indians would fight against the Americans. It is a mystery as to why they were fighting the Americans on the side of the British, but that is something we can talk about another time. So, the War of 1812 began because the British had been a bit unceremoniously stealing American men and forcing them to join the Royal Navy. This had caused a lot of problems between the United States and Britain. Many in Britain were still kind of thinking they could get the colonies back, the rebellious colonies back, and they had a dismissive attitude towards the United States. So this impressing of Americans wasn't seen as a very big deal by the British establishment and the military. But for the Americans it was. And so eventually it got to a point where they decided they needed to draw a line under what the Brits were doing. The Americans also thought this could be a good time to finish off what they had started and to take the entire North American continent. They wanted the Brits out. Unfortunately for them, the French Canadians and the formerly Americans, who are now the Loyalists, or the English Canadians you could say, were having none of this. They did not want to be a part of the United States. They resisted this. And on this day, 13th of October, 1812, the Americans attempted to disable and destroy Canada. The idea was to send an army from Lake Champlain in New York up to Montreal and capture Montreal. Another army would go from what is now Detroit into what is now Windsor and march up the Ontario Peninsula. And another would cross the Niagara River, capture some towns, and then march towards York, what is now Toronto. So they thought, well, by the time we've done this, it'll be easy. The British are still fighting in Europe. Napoleon and his lot. They haven't got enough people to send over here to fight us. It's a great time to go in and take what is rightfully ours. Unfortunately, the Loyalists were not going to stand down. They were not going to lie down and allow the Americans to come and take what little they had left. And the American Indians, or say the Canadian Indians, or natives, or whatever you want to call them, also were ready to fight. So, the Battle of Queenston Heights. Queenston is a place on the Niagara River. It is now a part of the Canadian town of Niagara. It was a small little place, but the Americans thought they could take it quite easily and then use that to march on York the next year. It was coming up towards winter, so North America, it's going to be quite cold at this time of year. So they weren't planning on marching on what is now Toronto now. What they wanted was to secure the Niagara River, and then in spring they could march towards York. So the New York militia and United States regulars, they marched over the river and met the British regulars and local militia, as well as Mohawk warriors. The British were led by Isaac Brooke, or Brock, and they had a battle. And strangely enough, the British and the Canadians and the Mohawks won this battle. Bit of a disaster for the Americans who were on home soil and thought it'd be a walkover. Their invasion towards Montreal didn't even get off to a start. Down in Detroit, it was another disaster because the Indians had surrounded the fort in Detroit and it had to be surrendered. So they didn't even invade Ontario either. This war would go on for another 2 years, But in 1814, Napoleon had been defeated, and the British they had all these soldiers who were very experienced. They'd been fighting for decades at this point, and they started sending them over to Canada. And the United States recognized that they could not fight any longer. Washington had been burned to the ground. The federal government had fled into Pennsylvania. York had been burned by the Americans. Overall, it wasn't the greatest war in all of history, but it did create a founding myth for Canada, because both the French Canadians and the English Canadians had fought off with British forces the American attempted invasion. And this led as well to a much more wider divide than had been there before. And it took many decades, maybe even a century or more, before Canada actually trusted the United States. As late as the 1930s, Canada had a plan to fight a war with the United States. The plan was to attack places like Seattle, Detroit, Lake Champlain, Minneapolis as fast as possible. They knew that they couldn't win a war, but they thought they'll attack first, and then Britain could send over forces to reinforce them. Thankfully, this never took place, and I doubt very much that Canada has any sorts of plans like that anymore. But it does show you the distrust that grew not only from this war, but from the American War of Independence. In many ways, you could say the American War of Independence was a civil war, and only a part of the American colonies separated and the other part remained. And so, from division comes distrust. But on this day, the Mohawks, the Canadians, and the British fought and defeated the Americans at the Battle of Queenston. General Brock himself died at this battle. A noble end, you could say. And in many ways you could say this was the real beginning of Canada. So, tune in tomorrow for another video, and subscribe and comment and like. Take care.